Hi everyone, welcome. We are right at the top of the hour right now, but we are going to give everyone about another 1 or 2 minutes to log in because I'm watching the numbers tick up. So I don't want anybody to miss anything, including the housekeeping stuff. So we're just going to give everyone about another minute or so. All right, we are at about 1 minute past. I still see the numbers ticking up, but we have so much to cover in so little time. So let's get started. Welcome everyone to Serving and Supporting LGBTQ plus Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence, which is presented as part of the National Center for Victims of Crime Countdown to Boston, a National Training Institute webinar series. I am Renee Williams, Executive Director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. Can we go to the next slide? We are so excited to have you all here, but there are a couple of housekeeping items / ground rules. I think everybody probably knows these at this point because we've been in this Zoom moment forever, but just as a reminder, we are recording this webinar and we will also be providing the recording and the slides probably tomorrow if there's anything you want to catch up on, but it's humans that are doing that, so give us a couple of days, but we promise we will be providing those. If you have any technical issues at all, please send a private chat message to Dashiell Coleman. You'll see Dashiell in the participants list and you'll be able to send him a chat if you've got any issues. We are not doing attendance certificates or CEU credits. They will not be provided, but again, the slides and the recording will be. Live captioning is available for those who need it. If you just click on the show cap, there's a button that says show captions at the bottom of your screen. It will enable those captions for you. And this is the big one, and I cannot stress this enough. Please put all of your questions in that Q&A box. Do not put it in the chat. I think everybody can see that the chat's already going a little wild. So if you put the questions in that box, we will not be able to keep up. Please put those in the Q&A box. A note about the questions. We're gonna try to ask the questions that are on point to the conversation as it's going in the moment, but we might hold a couple until the end. So don't get panicked if we haven't answered your question yet, probably holding it for the end. Next slide, please. And as I said before, this is part of our road to Boston, the road to NTI, and we hope you'll join us at the 2023 National Training Institute. If you scan that code, it'll take you right to a registration page. Standard registrations available until August 2nd. After that, the prices jump up. We do have sponsorship and exhibiting opportunities available. My understanding is registration is really through the roofs this year, so it's probably a great year to exhibit, but also make sure you're there. I have been working on the plenaries. They're going to be amazing, and we have over 60 other workshop sessions. Next slide, please. And then finally, next month's webinar in this countdown to Boston. I'm excited about this one. I've seen bits and pieces of this one with these folks. It's the soul-crushing job, emotional labor, and secondary trauma of prosecuting sexual assault cases, but it is relevant to anybody that is in victim services. And Tammy really does an outstanding job. So that will be Wednesday, July 19th from 2 to 3. There should have been an email in your inboxes yesterday if you subscribe to these, but we will make sure that you know about it, and the registration will be up and available soon. And next slide, please. And with that, my job here is done, except to say that I am very excited to welcome Amanda Gould, who is a Senior Program Manager, and Amy Belm, who's the Program Training Manager for the National LGBTQ Institute on Intimate Partner Violence, which is a project of the Los Angeles LGBT Center. Amanda and Amy, I'm turning it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Renee. We are so excited to be here with you all this morning on the West Coast, this afternoon on the East Coast. We are coming to you today from the National LGBTQ Institute on Intimate Partner Violence. Again, we're a project of the Los Angeles LGBT Center, and we do this work in close collaboration with the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs and In Our Own Voices, Inc. And we were created to significantly enhance the safety, well-being, support, and health of LGBTQ intimate partner violence survivors throughout the United States. So again, my name's Amy Belm. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Program Training Manager.
And I'm Amanda Gould. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm the Senior Program Manager.
And for folks who just joined, again, a couple housekeeping things. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. And if you'd like to see captions, you can look at the Show Captions button at the bottom of your toolbar, and you'll be able to see captions today. This training is being recorded. So we want to acknowledge that the Los Angeles LGBT Center is on stolen and colonized Tongva and Chumash land. And we know these people have been stewards of this land for thousands of years. We encourage everyone to learn about the land you're occupying and the Native people who have existed and continue to exist in these spaces at native-land.ca. We know it's important to acknowledge the impact of colonialization on Indigenous and Native communities because of the impact colonialization has on sexual and domestic violence and the high rates of violence that these communities are experiencing. And we want this to be more than just stating the land we're occupying, and use this as a commitment to you all to include Indigenous perspectives and voices in the work that we do, and also as a call to action to any training participant to be mindful and intentional of including Native and Indigenous LGBTQ+ survivors in the work you're doing as well. And we also want to acknowledge the many people and organizations whose material we've drawn from for this presentation. And we specifically want to highlight that much of this work was created by BIPOC, queer, and trans folks who are continuing to do impactful work to increase access to services for LGBTQ+ survivors of intimate partner violence. So many of you are already doing this, which is excellent. In the chat, we've introduced ourselves. We would love to know a little bit more about you all. So we'd love to see your name, your pronouns. Pronouns are just what we use when we don't use your name. Your location. So if you're joining us from a state, we'd love to know which state you're joining us from, and the organization or agency in which you work. And as folks are continuing to do that, I'll pass it over to Amanda.
I want to ground us in a content and trigger warning at the beginning of this presentation. Is the material we're going to go over today talks about some heavy topics, including homophobia and biphobia and transphobia, as well as domestic violence and sexual assault. We know that this can bring up a lot of emotions or memories or even flashbacks of trauma that you may have experienced, or secondary trauma that you've experienced as a provider or a friend or a family member. And so, we really believe in embodying trauma-informed best practice, which includes giving people a trigger warning. A trigger warning is just simply a way to prepare your brain for a topic. That way it doesn't trigger an automatic trauma response to a sudden exposure to something that reminds you of a trauma that you've experienced. So in that vein, we encourage everyone to do what you need to do to take care of yourself, which can include taking breaks, engaging in grounding activities, including coloring or holding something in your hand, or eating or having a cup of hot tea with you, being mindful of your breathing, or whatever that looks like for you. So we are going to start off with an exercise, and I want to reground us in that content and trigger warning because this tends to be the heaviest part of the presentation, and it's potentially the most triggering part of the training. We know that survivors and LGBTQ+ folks are in the spaces that we train, and we know that this activity can be really difficult. So we ask that as much as you're able, try to put on your service provider hat during this activity and debrief as much as possible. So we're going to be following the experiences of a client, Jamie, as they try to access supportive services after an experience of domestic violence and sexual assault. So in a moment, I'll read Jamie's card. And after that, what I would like from you all is to put in the chat where Jamie should go for help. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just looking at these cards on the board here or on the screen here, and letting us know where you'd recommend that Jamie go for help after we hear what they have to share with us. So Jamie says, my partner sexually assaulted me. Can you help me? Where would we recommend of these options here on the screen that Jamie go for support first? And you can put your answers in the chat. I'm seeing DV agency in the chat. So the domestic violence agency says, I'm so sorry, but we just can't take you into our shelter right now. It would mean putting all the women here in jeopardy. We can offer you a hotel room for a couple of nights. Again, we're so sorry, it's just policy. Maybe you should try your local homeless shelter. That would probably be much safer for everyone involved. Where would we recommend that Jamie go next for support? I'm seeing police officer in the chat. The police officer says, I don't even know how to write this up. It seems like you're both at fault. Can't you just tell your partner to leave you alone? Where should Jamie go next for support? I'm seeing sexual assault crisis center in the chat. We have a women's group for survivors of sexual violence, but I'm not sure that you'd fit with that group. There might be a support group at your local LGBT center for people like you. I'm seeing LGBT center in the chat. We have some brochures that you can take with you to read. I think that there are some hotline numbers on some of them that you can call. We have support groups for coming out, but we don't really have services for people who are experiencing domestic violence. Where should Jamie go next for support? I'm seeing hotline volunteer in the chat. It doesn't seem like our program is a good fit for you. Why don't you call your local LGBT center? Where should Jamie go next for support? Seeing forensic nurse in the chat. This is going to be pretty uncomfortable for me because I've never dealt with someone like you before. I don't even know how to document your injuries in my notes or whether to call you male or female. So how long ago did you decide to become transgender, and what kind of surgery have you had? Just so that I'm not surprised when I start my examination. Where should Jamie go next for support? I'm seeing therapist in the chat. I'm not really an appropriate therapist for you. I don't really have any trans clients. Maybe I can refer you out to another provider. Where should Jamie go next for support? Seeing parent in the chat. The parent says, I wish you wouldn't have decided to become transgender. I knew you wouldn't be safe. Where should Jamie go next for support? I'm seeing clergy in the chat. The church will be here when you're ready to leave your lifestyle. Where should Jamie go next for support? I'm seeing friend in the chat. Come on, Jamie, you're both my good friends. Please don't put me in the middle of this. I've heard both sides of the story and it sounds like you are both to blame. Don't make me choose between the two of you. Where should Jamie go next for support? Seeing attorney in the chat. I don't think that you have a clear legal issue here. I do not have much experience with LGBTQ cases, but at the very least, I would recommend that you try to file a civil harassment order. I would suggest that you talk to someone to process some of the things that you've been through, since I am not a therapist. Where should Jamie go next for support? I'm seeing judge in the chat. This is a case where this is one person's word against another's. I'm unable to determine who's the abuser in the situation, and I don't think either of you are credible given your situation. Therefore, I'm going to issue mutual restraining orders. I'm seeing ex-husband in the chat. Your lifestyle is too much for me and the kids. I am suing for full custody. And then lastly, we have Jamie's abuser who says, I told you that no one would help you because you did this to yourself. I'll pass it over to Amy for the debrief.
Great. So we want to do a debrief of this activity. I know it's challenging to do with just the chat, but we do want to try to do it anyways. I'm already seeing some debrief happening in the chat. And so I'd love for us to start with just one word emotion flash. And I'm seeing that already in the chat. So just one word about how you're feeling after this activity and seeing Jamie's experience. I'm seeing a lot of angry, frustrated, sad, anxious, demoralized, hopeless, aggravated, angry. Thank you. Let's go to the next question. I'm wondering what this experience was like for folks. So you're welcome again to throw this in the chat. I've noticed that some folks are adding some of their responses in the Q&A. So I just want to send you to the chat for responding to the questions that we're asking. Just so we don't miss you. I'm seeing in the chat, it was really discouraging for the victim. It was eye-opening and shocking. I see frustrating, even though there were a ton of resources. Yeah. I also see I work for a hotline, and I really hope no one from my organization would ever respond to a caller that way. Yeah, thank you so much for these responses. Folks who are working in the domestic violence field or intimate partner violence fields, I'm sure aren't as surprised by some of these responses. We know people are getting these responses all over the country. This isn't just located in one geographic area. I'm also seeing in the chat, I get why clients are so deflated by the time they get to my office doing legal aid. And I'm also seeing I felt so frustrating because I know these obstacles are really out there and it isn't easy at all. Yeah. I'm also seeing it's also hard when you're advocating for your client and you're a safe space advocating for another org and then they can't help. Yeah, I think that's one thing this activity really highlights is that even if there are a few people in an organization who are doing really inclusive work for LGBTQ survivors, that might not be consistent across the agency, right? Yeah, the next question's great. So were you surprised by any of these responses? And I'm seeing the lack of support from the LGBT Center really surprised me. Yeah, I think that response is kind of surprising for folks. And it makes me think about how agencies are funded. So many LGBT centers across the US, if they exist in a state, don't have supportive services for domestic violence survivors often. I'm seeing respond by the Sexual Assault Crisis Center. And the crisis center should have more compassion. Yeah. I'm also seeing surprising but not shocked. I'm seeing in the chat as well, as a trans person, that's makes me sad, but it's why I do this work. Thank you for doing this work. I'm wondering, after seeing this experience of Jamie's, what would you offer a client when all of these other options are exhausted? I'm seeing empathy and kindness. Advocacy and someone who can intercede. I see, I would go searching. There has to be something out there, even if it's not local. Thanks. I'm seeing a few times making direct referrals to organizations that folks know are inclusive. Excellent. Or putting a client in a motel or hotel room and trying to find places to help them feel safe. Thank you. And lastly, as part of this debrief, I'm wondering what kind of meaning we take away from this activity. What kind of meaning do we take away from this activity? I'm seeing there's a lot of work to do, that resources need to be for all. We need more resources, more training needed by organizations, that extreme bias exists, barriers exist, absolutely. I also see that everyone thinks that someone else will help. Yeah. Think in reading these responses and thinking about this activity, I know that the reason why we give these trainings, and they're one of the reasons why our project exists to begin with, is because we're trying to make sure that, survivors like Jamie aren't being met with wrong door after wrong door, and as soon as that they come to your agency, they're being met with culturally responsive services that leave them feeling seen and heard, respected and empowered. So we are going to go over some concepts in language to make sure that we're understanding LGBTQ identities, so that we can provide more culturally specific services to the survivors we're working with. And we really want to make it so that survivors aren't being put in a position of having to explain who they are or answer questions that can feel interrogating or invasive when they're just trying to access supportive services. So we are going to cover SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And we want to emphasize that this slide alone could be the whole training today. This slide alone could be a whole semester's class in college. We know that gender, sex, and sexuality are really rich concepts with many layers to explore. And we're simply going to provide a brief overview of these concepts, identities, and language by covering SOGI. So first, we're going to look at sex assigned at birth. And this is a social identity category that relates to the meaning assigned to your physical characteristics, your genetics, anatomy, hormones, chromosomes, secondary sex characteristics, and genitalia. And I think it's really important to note that sex isn't something we're necessarily born with, but something that doctors or our parents are assigning us at birth. And we're typically taught that there are only two sexes assigned at birth, male and female. And we know that not everyone fits inside of this binary. And binary just means one of two parts, or something is this or it's that. There's two options, essentially. We know that intersex is a general term used for a variety of situations in which a person's born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit the boxes of female or male. Intersex people are actually super common. It's as likely for a baby to be born intersex as it is for a baby to be born with red hair. Then we have gender identity. And gender identity is each person's internal and individual experience of gender. It's a person's internal sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither. And a person's gender identity may be the same as or different from the sex they were assigned at birth. Because gender identity is internal to someone's experience, this means you really can't assume how someone identifies just by looking at them. So we have some examples: man, woman, and non-binary. Non-binary is often used as an umbrella term to cover all people whose gender identity fits outside of the binary of man and woman. And we know there are other identities inside this umbrella too, like genderqueer, gender non-conforming, agender, two-spirit, and more. And for many people, their gender identity does align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And we would refer to those folks as cisgender, CIS, gender, meaning that if you were assigned female at birth and identify as a woman your whole life, that would make you a cisgender woman. And for people, they may feel like their gender identity doesn't align with the sex that they were assigned at birth, which would make them transgender, or trans for short. And then we have gender expression, which relates to how a person expresses themselves, typically through their appearance, their dress, and their behavior. We know gender expression can be feminine or masculine, which are culturally defined terms, or gender expression can be androgynous, which means gender expression that combines masculine and feminine elements of expression, or elements that exist outside of masculine or feminine norms of expression. And we say culturally defined because gender expression is so varied based on culture and geography. What's considered masculine or feminine in one culture is often completely different than what's considered masculine and feminine in another culture. I'm seeing a question in the chat really quick. Could you explain gender fluid? Gender fluid means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. One way that folks can identify gender fluid is that their gender expression varies based on the day, the week, the month. And so you might see someone who is wearing typically feminine clothing, so dresses or makeup. And the next day they might not be wearing dresses or makeup. They might be wearing a suit. They might be wearing something that's seen as masculine in society. And Amanda, I'll leave it to you if you want to add anything to that response.
We're going over some really common terminology today, but there are a lot of really beautiful and wonderful terms out there to describe people's identity and experiences. And we'll come back to this multiple times as people have different definitions for how they identify with that. So someone might identify their gender expression as gender fluid, like Amy just went over, but someone could also have a gender identity that is gender fluid, is similar to non-binary, not existing within a binary, but flowing from one gender identity to another on a regular basis. But we're going to go back to this over and over again, is allow individuals to self-identify what those words mean to them.
Thank you, Amanda. And our last identity we are going to look at is sexual orientation, which relates to who someone's attracted to romantically, emotionally, or sexually. And so there are lesbian or gay folks, which are terms that describe same gender attraction. So lesbian is typically used to describe women who are attracted to other women. Gay is typically used to describe men who are attracted to other men, but this is also used as a catch-all phrase for the whole community. So you might hear gay pride, for example. Then we have heterosexual, which is a term used to describe people who experience sexual or romantic attraction to people of another gender. There's bisexual, which is an umbrella term used to refer to someone who experiences attraction to more than one gender. And then we have queer, which is a term used by some people to identify their sexual orientation or gender identities outside of societal norms and view the term as more fluid. It's important to note that some LGBTQ+ people find this term offensive because of its history as a derogatory term, while others have taken the power back and used this term as a form of self-empowerment and maybe as a political statement. We also have asexual, which is a term used to describe people who experience little to no sexual attraction to others. Asexual people might still be in relationships. I pass it over to Amanda.
So a note on language we want to make is we don't want to make assumptions about someone's identities based off behaviors. So we never ever want to label survivors' identities for them that we're working with, right? Is say a survivor I'm working with is a man and he shares with me that he's had past partners who are men and women. I don't assume that that survivor is bisexual or call him bisexual for him. I wait to mirror the identity labels that he's using, which brings me to the next point, which is mirror the language your client is using. And this is already something that's best trauma-informed practice when working with domestic violence, is say a survivor calls their abuser that they are married to their ex. We wouldn't want to call that person their husband or wife or spouse. We would want to mirror the language that person's using and say ex. Similarly, when it comes to identity labels, we always want to mirror the language that that person is using to refer to themselves and the people in their lives. Which brings us to the next point, which is sometimes we don't have those cues yet, right? So we want to use neutral language when we're unsure of a survivor's gender or their partner or abusive partner's gender. So this means really, really simple language shifts like partner or previous partner or people or clients or survivors. Just switching to gender inclusive terminology so we avoid making assumptions about folks. Next is language and words that communities use to define themselves very temporally and geographically and culturally. And I know I've seen a lot of questions in the chat asking about specific identities from gender fluid to pansexual. I wish we had time to go over all the definitions today, but we don't. But there are amazing glossaries out there online. There are a lot of different terms out there that people use to put words and meaning to their experiences. And, again, we don't have time to go over all of them today. And they vary so much from person to person, what the definition of those things mean. And because many oppressed communities have had their right to self-identify taken away from them, using respectful language is the first important step towards creating safer space for queer and trans survivors. And lastly, we know LGBTQ folks are incredibly diverse and come from all different backgrounds, racially, ethnically, socioeconomically, and more. So I did see in the chat folks asking questions about pronouns. Don't you worry, we got you. When we're talking about pronouns, we're simply talking about the words we use to refer to someone when we're not using their name. So some common pronoun sets we might be more comfortable with or familiar with are she, her, hers, and he, him, his to refer to folks. There's also they, them, theirs. This is a pronoun set we already use in the English language all the time when we don't know the gender of someone we're talking about. So example I always give is, say for example, I had a group of friends over of all different genders to my home. Someone forgot their scarf. As the last guest is leaving, I say, hey, someone forgot their scarf. Can you figure out who this belongs to and give it to them? Right? I don't know the gender of the scarf owner, and so I use they, them pronouns. Similarly, when we don't know the gender of a client we're working with that client's abuser, with other people in that client's life, we want to use they, them pronouns. Additionally, folks who particularly identify under the non-binary umbrella, though not exclusively, may use they, them pronouns as their pronoun consistently. So for example, I would say Amanda went to their office to grab their book. Some folks may also use multiple pronoun sets like myself. So I have both she and they pronouns. In that case, you would want to change up the pronouns you're using with someone. So you could say Amanda went to their office to grab her book. Some folks may use no pronouns and may use their name instead. So in that case, you would say Amanda went to Amanda's office to grab Amanda's book. And these aren't all inclusive, as there's also neopronouns. As you know, like we said, language is constantly shifting and evolving, and people are using it to self-identify what feels right to them. So there's also neopronouns, which are pronoun sets that exist outside of these pronoun sets we have here on the screen. And if you're feeling unsure and unclear on how those conjugate, just ask for clarity from the person who's using neopronouns and do some examples of those conjugation verbal examples I walked you through, and then make practice for accuracy over time. So next, we want to talk about misgendering. The term misgendering is to refer to someone intentionally or unintentionally using the incorrect pronouns or name or gendered language that someone doesn't use. And this can be done intentionally to cause harm, emotional and psychological harm, which we'll get into later, or unintentionally because of assumptions that we're making. So the important thing is if we misgender someone, we want to apologize, correct, and move on, and then practice privately, not with that person, to avoid making mistakes in the future. So some common mistakes that we see all the time that are well-intentioned are first to over-apologize. And this looks like something like, oh, I'm just so sorry. It's really hard for me to get used to the they, them, theirs pronoun thing. This is really new to me. Like, have patience with me. I'm trying. And this comes from a place of wanting that person to know you're trying, and I get that. But what it actually does is it puts that person in the awkward position of having to comfort you for something that you did that caused them harm. So instead, apologize, keep it brief, correct, and move on. The other mistake that we see oftentimes from folks is to breeze past it and hope that the person didn't notice. Chances are they did notice. So by apologizing and correcting, you're showing that person, along with anyone else who might be in that shared space, that you know you made a mistake, that you're committed to correcting it, and again, not over apologizing as well. And then practice privately. You can practice with colleagues, you can practice with friends, family members, on your dog or cat or stuffed animal, whatever it takes, is practice privately if it is something that you feel like you're struggling with. That way you're not making that person your practicing ground. So I think a lot of people get really stumped when we talk about they, them, theirs pronouns or gender inclusive language, and it's actually quite simple. And I have here on the screen some examples of some simple language shifts we can use to avoid gendering people and to use gender inclusive language. So you'll see here, a client is here to see you. They mentioned that they had an appointment at 5, but they are here a little early. The caller is fleeing their abuser. They need shelter. Their abuser has been calling their friends and family members trying to find the caller. Your ex is threatening you. Where did you last see them? I'm calling about a survivor who needs a restraining order. The abuser is currently in jail. As you can see, these examples on the screen are not awkward. They're language choices that we use on a day-to-day basis in this work that we use. It's just committing to making sure we're not making assumptions about the clients that we're working with, the survivors that we're working with, or their abusive partners. And this makes sure that we're not making assumptions that might hurt the survivor, might cue the survivor into thinking, this is not an LGBTQ safe space, and I don't feel safe or comfortable disclosing parts of my experience or identity. And instead create safe and inclusive environments for survivors that we work with. So we are going to put this into practice real quick. Is if you could put in the chat box your name, hi, my name is blank, and I use blank pronouns. How about you? Practice makes better. So we want to try to incorporate using pronouns in our introduction so we can signal to folks that we're an LGBTQ inclusive space. And I also recommend that folks try to start moving to use pronouns in their daily introductions and add them to their email signatures and business cards and name tags and more. Seeing the responses flooding in, that's perfect. Thank you for that practice. And we want to remember, terms are always changing, as language is constantly evolving and shifting, and we are giving you best practice language around working with queer and trans folks now, but we are an ever-growing and changing community, and just like what's best practice 10 years ago has been expanded and changed to what is best practice now, this information will likely grow and change as well. So it's really important that we always want to be learning and growing in our learning and knowledge basis, and not treating this as a one and done training. It's critically important to allow individuals to self-identify and mirror the language that they're using. And words and language are powerful, which is why we start this presentation off with grounding us in that language and terminology piece. So some best practice tips. We'll end each section with best practice tips is how can we tangibly take this knowledge into the work that we do with survivors. First, introduce yourself with your name and pronouns to all clients. You can ask simply, what is your name and what are your pronouns? Don't assume gender or sexual orientation based on appearance. And this is really important because we want to make sure we're giving referrals that are important to queer and trans survivors to all folks that we work with, not just clients we're making assumptions around. Don't ask clients invasive questions about their sexuality, gender, or body parts. So I think back to that response from the forensic nurse we saw in the Jamie exercise, right? Asking invasive questions about what surgeries or body parts that survivor has in a way that made the survivor feel uncomfortable and dehumanized. So ask yourself if the question you're asking is helpful to providing a respectful and supportive environment, or is it to satisfy your own curiosity? Next is collect optional demographic information at intake, including sexual orientation, gender identity, and pronouns. And we say that all demographic information, including these, should be optional so that survivors can decide what to self-disclose about their identity. If they aren't comfortable or don't feel safe sharing parts of their identity, be it race or gender, sexual orientation, or more, these should all be optional areas. But having this as an option on intake forms cues the client that you're an LGBTQ inclusive space and allows us to collect meaningful and important data. Do ask clients what name that they go by and use that name. And if you do need their legal name, if you're, say, attorney, or you're making a legal referral to an attorney, or you're supporting a survivor with a restraining order, you may need to collect that person's legal name. This is also known as a dead name by the trans community, meaning a name that person no longer goes by. So we never want to use that name in day-to-day use with the client. However, if we do need that information for legal purposes, it may be important for us to collect. And lastly, if you make a mistake, apologize sincerely, but don't make the client feel like they need to take care of you. And I will toss it over to Amy.
Thank you. So we're trying to answer the questions as they come in the Q&A, but if it takes us a little time, I ask for your patience. There's also some great stuff in the chat I want to highlight, especially thinking about Two-Spirit folks. Maggie says, I highly recommend Lenny Hayes of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center for more information on the Two-Spirit LGBTQ community and the Native community. Yes, absolutely. The National Indigenous Women's Resource Center is excellent, and we would also highly recommend them. So just want to let folks know that those resources are available for them out there. All right, so we're going to start this section talking about intersectionality because we think it's really important to note that LGBTQ survivors' experiences aren't limited to those identities alone. LGBTQ plus folks aren't a monolith and hold many additional identities that impact the way they exist in the world, like their race, their ability, their socioeconomic status, immigration status, and so much more. So intersectionality, I'm sure most of you know, is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s In a more recent interview, Kimberly Crenshaw said, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ plus problem here. And if we're taking an intersectional perspective, it means that we're not going to look at someone's experience as a survivor and all of the inequities, oppression, and barriers that they experience solely based on this identity. And we don't look at someone's experience as an LGBTQ plus person and the inequities, oppression, and barriers that they experience solely based on that identity. And we want to look at how these identities are intersecting in ways that present unique systemic and individual barriers and challenges and how that manifests for someone. And we also want to look at how an LGBTQ plus survivor's identity intersects with the other aspects of their identity, like their race, ability, immigration status, and more. And we know that all the identities we hold impact the way in which we exist in the world and how society as a whole responds to us. And this means we have to create services for survivors that meet them at their many identities and think of inclusivity for LGBTQ plus survivors as a part of our larger inclusivity efforts as agencies. So we're using privilege and oppression, so I want to define these words. Privilege relates to one's unearned access to resources and ability to influence others because of their social identity group. So in this case, we're talking about heterosexual and or cisgender people. Oppression relates to the systemic and pervasive negative impacts on groups of people because of their social identity group. We are talking about LGBTQ plus people here. We know that these systems of oppression, like the laws and policies of larger systems, affect an individual's likelihood of experiencing discrimination and bias in their day-to-day interactions. And it's really important to note that BIPOC LGBTQ survivors in particular are experiencing more complex and severe forms of discrimination and bias. So not only are BIPOC LGBTQ plus survivors experiencing homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, but they're also experiencing racism and the barriers that, that racist systems create. And so we also need to talk about this impact of stigma, which means that, you know, dealing with stigma has been linked to these higher rates of mental health disorders like depression and anxiety disorders, suicidal ideation and attempts, substance use disorders. And we know these are all risk factors for a host of chronic physical and mental health conditions. Important to note also that LGBTQ plus people have been shown to have higher rates of being denied access to medical care, are less likely to have health insurance, and more likely to experience discrimination when seeking out medical care, which complicates this whole situation. And then, you know, we are still in this pandemic, so we can't ignore the impact that COVID's having. And studies have shown across the board that domestic violence prevalence and severity has increased during the pandemic. And we know that bisexual and transgender adults are more likely to experience long COVID due to these additional negative health outcomes. And this is further complicated by being less likely to have health insurance. So it's critical that we know no cost or low cost healthcare resources in our communities that are LGBTQ plus inclusive, so that we're meeting the many needs of the survivors that we're working with. So some words we might be familiar with, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, which is the fear or dislike of someone based on prejudice or negative attitudes or beliefs or views about lesbian, gay, bi, or trans people. This can include denying someone's lesbian, gay, bi, or trans identity or refusing to accept it. And homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia may be targeted at people who are or people who are perceived to be lesbian, gay, bi, or trans. Some words that might be newer are heterocentrism and ciscentrism. So we know that the oppression that LGBTQ plus people experience isn't just limited to outright bias, hatred, or fear. It can be these cultural and social assumptions about what is right, natural, or proper, and how that shapes our society. So heterocentrism is an assumption, often subconscious, that everyone is heterosexual, and the attitudes and behaviors associated with this assumption. And then ciscentrism, similarly, is an assumption, often subconscious, that everyone is cisgender, and the attitudes and behaviors associated with this assumption. And we know that heterocentrism and ciscentrism are often showing up in these less intentional ways in everyday life. And so a question for you all to throw in answers in the chat: how have you seen this show up in your everyday life? Or how have you seen heterocentrism or ciscentrism show up in your workplace? Yeah, not asking folks pronouns. Images in the media. Yeah, people assuming that you're in a relationship with someone of a different gender, being misgendered, bathroom accessibility, asking if a baby is a boy or a girl. I would say like gender reveal parties fall into this category. I don't always think that folks having them are doing them in this intentional way that's like homophobic or transphobic, but certainly it is that. I see in the chat an unwillingness to be open-minded, assuming heterosexuality if you're straight passing. Yeah, I always think about a past job that because of the way that we collected data for our grant funding, having to select someone's like sex they were assigned at birth as their gender and kind of conflating the two when that's not really the case. I see coworkers referring to survivors in our program as ladies rather than survivors in meetings, yeah. Or I would say agencies that have women's in the title. I don't think that folks who are working at agencies with women in the title are always intentionally leaving people out, right? These agencies were created often in like the 70s and 80s, and so it was common to have that in the title, and maybe they're serving people who aren't women. And so I don't think it's an intentional thing, right? Yeah. I see being noticeably shocked when someone shares they're not heterosexual. I see in the chat, last year we changed our name from the Women's Center to the Survivor Empowerment Center. That's excellent. Yeah. And changing names is really hard. It takes a lot of planning and money often, and it's an excellent thing to do. So congratulations on being able to get that done. I see more folks are taking women out of their shelter titles. That's excellent. Excellent. Yeah, this seems like a common theme, and I hope it's one we keep. Great. So some best practice tips we have from this section. Really, and these are best practice tips we can use as providers to kind of disrupt that heterocentrism and ciscentrism and make sure that survivors are feeling safe, affirmed, and seen when they're accessing services. And because of that intersectional perspective that we just talked about, it's really important that we're meeting survivors, not just on their identity as survivors, but at the intersections of their many identities and ensuring that survivor supportive services are inclusive to LGBTQ plus survivors. So that first best practice tip is providing gender inclusive restrooms. I think this is actually much easier in practice than we kind of think it is. We worked at a larger community-based mental health organization in the heart of St. Louis City, Missouri. And on our first floor, the multi-stall restroom that was large was an all-gender restroom. And folks used it without question often. It was where clients went to the restroom. It was where staff went to the restroom and more. And every once in a while, a client would say, hey, you took me to the wrong bathroom. And I would just say, oh, this is a bathroom for everyone. If it makes you uncomfortable at all, we can take you somewhere else. And 99.9% of the time, folks were perfectly happy using that bathroom. They were just confused because they hadn't used a multi-stall restroom with people of other genders before. And so those were folks in acute mental health crisis. And so I think that this is actually much easier in practice than we kind of make it out to be. The next one is asking all clients about sexual orientation and gender identity on intake forms. It's so important that we're doing this because we need to give folks a chance to identify themselves, to self-identify, and it can help us know who we're missing, who's not accessing our services, or who's not feeling safe to share their identities with us. And folks might not feel safe even if you're doing everything you can be to be inclusive, and they might share those identities with you later. And so asking folks about their demographic information more than once is often helpful, especially if you're working with folks over a period of time. We also have, providing gender integrated support groups or LGBTQ specific support groups for survivors. I think if you have a gender integrated support group, you can say something like, this is a support group for all people of all genders, of all sexual orientations. That way LGBTQ survivors know that they're safe accessing those services. And then we also have a few like visual ways to show that you're inclusive as an agency. So you can, go the route of like flags, stickers, posters in your waiting rooms, and so much more. And then you can also help decrease the invisibility of LGBTQ+ people by including stories, facts, and more about LGBTQ+ individuals in your brochures, reports, and on your websites. You can also, again, use gender inclusive language, using words like partner, using pronouns like they, them, unless other pronouns or information are given. And then lastly, you can include pronouns in staff email signatures. You can also do this in your Zoom accounts. And you can simply do this by renaming yourself. So if you are able to find, look on the participants and find your name, you can click on the 3 dots or more. You just go down to rename and you can add your pronouns. So this is something that's pretty easy to do, helps folks know that you are making efforts to be inclusive. Pass it over to Amanda.
All right. So I think all of this that we've gone over so far is really important context and foundation for us to really do the deep dive into the meat of this presentation, which is how does intimate partner violence uniquely impact LGBTQ survivors, and how can we better support the unique and specific needs of LGBTQ survivors coming into contact with our services. So I'm going to start off with a poll question, and if I could have folks just write their number in the chat, that you're seeing here on the screen. So the question is, how common do you think domestic violence is in LGBTQ+ communities compared to the general population? Put a 1 for less common, 2 for just as common, 3 for more common, and 4 for unsure. Give folks a moment to put their answers in. Okay, I'm seeing a good range of different answers here, which I think reflects the lack of visibility of knowledge about how common LGBTQ intimate partner violence is we often don't know how common it is in the community. So what we're seeing here on the screen is statistics based off on the left. The 2 bar charts are from the CDC, done on lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence. And on the right, this chart, the circular chart, is done by the U.S. Transgender Survey on lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence for transgender individuals. So what we see is that across the board, when statistics are collected on LGBTQ folks' experiences with IPV, we know that LGBTQ people experience intimate partner violence at higher rates than cisgender and heterosexual people, due to widespread discrimination and bias and risk factors for violence associated with discrimination, hatred, and anti-community violence. So is there anything that is sticking out to folks in looking at this chart? We see the red is for bisexual, yellow is for gay and lesbian, green is for heterosexual. This left bar chart's for men, this right bar chart's for women. Is there anything that's sticking out to folks looking at this chart, or that's surprising or not surprising? I'm seeing trans women are at highest risk of domestic violence. As yes, we know trans people, particularly trans women, experience really high rates of domestic violence. Again, due to that heightened stigma and objectification and community isolation associated with anti-trans bias. And that's really important for us to name and talk about, is how those structural forms of violence and discrimination lead to barriers that put trans people at risk. I'm also seeing bisexual women have the highest rate, which surprised me. yes, we get that reaction from a lot of people, is this study, along with many studies done, have shown that bisexual people, bisexual women in particular, experience some of the highest rates of domestic violence and sexual violence of any other sexual minority. And we know, again, this has to do with that heightened objectification of bisexual women, is when an identity is objectified and isolated and ostracized from in and out community, folks in that identity are at higher risk of violence. And there are a lot of stereotypes around bisexuality that encourage jealousy as a form of abuse. And this plays into those dynamics. I'm also seeing racial backgrounds not captured, absolutely, as we desperately need studies done on the cross sections of identities and the intersections of identities, and that data is really lacking. And then I also see gay men have the lowest risk, and that's really surprising to me and interesting. I think something that I always want us to take a grain of salt with all data collected, particularly looking at this, is that we know that men are less likely to identify experiences of sexual violence or domestic violence as sexual or domestic violence because of the lack of visibility and the erasure of experiences of men's experiences of violence. And gay men have this intersection of both the stigma and erasure of experiences as men experiencing these forms of violence and the stigma and erasure of queer people experiencing these forms of violence. And so likely we believe that this is lower statistic is due to underreporting. So what we know is across the board, LGBT folks experience higher rates of domestic violence, yet one of the biggest difference is that there are fewer resources for individuals experiencing LGBTQ intimate partner violence or sexual assault. There's a big difference between what we see in community and who's coming through the doors of an agency, right? We know that only 1 in 5 survivors of same gender sexual assault and domestic violence received any victim services. So why do we think that is? What are some of the barriers LGBTQ plus survivors face? Type your answers in the chat. What do we think some of the barriers LGBTQ survivors face? I'm saying not being believed, absolutely. Women's only shelters, if you're not a woman, not being able to find safe shelter. Being told it's just a cat fight, yes, particularly for women who are experiencing abuse from another woman, they can have their abuse downplayed. Stigma around HIV, stereotypes, not being believed, secondary victimization from law enforcement, police or family not knowing about someone's sexual orientation or gender identity and not wanting to be outed. Absolutely, outing is a huge component of barriers for LGBTQ for survivors. So we know there are a lot of unique factors for LGBTQ survivors, and we're going to go over just some of them, but we think these are really essential for understanding how to provide specific services that address the unique barriers and experiences of queer and trans survivors. The first is the lack of support of family of origin. You know, family support to fall back on or turn to around financial support, a safe space to stay, emotional support, and more. Is many LGBTQ people have their families of origin not accept them for who they are, kick them out of their houses or kick them out of their lives, and aren't that safety net that they need to be for LGBTQ survivors. The lack of visibility and awareness, when we don't see ourselves represented in most domestic violence spaces or in ads or brochures, or even TV and movies, right? Media representation. There's this creates an assumption that women can't be violent or men can't be survivors, and LGBTQ people don't experience domestic violence. Tight-knit communities can be another unique factor. If the survivor is a part of a tight-knit queer community, they might have a fear of folks in their community not believing them or taking sides, and that can cause the survivor to keep silent. They can also be afraid that there's nowhere they can exist in community without running into their abusive partner. And there's also a pressure to represent community positively that may lead survivors to remain silent and feel like they can't talk about their experience. And this can be internally within community for survivors whose relationship is put on a pedestal, as you guys give me hope that queer love is possible. Think about what pressure that puts on someone to maintain appearances of a relationship being positive. And also pressure to represent community externally, right? If the survivor is one of the few LGBTQ people their family or friends know about, they may feel like their relationship needs to be a positive representation of community and might feel uncomfortable or afraid to seek support outside of community. Internalized feelings of homophobia and biphobia and transphobia can compound with strong emotions around victim blaming and self-blame, and be a real barrier for LGBTQ survivors seeking support. And as was mentioned multiple times in the chat, as we saw in the exercise with Jamie at the beginning, that lack of institutional support for survivors is many LGBTQ survivors don't feel safe accessing law enforcement or restraining orders, or even domestic violence service providers for fear of being met with bias and discrimination like we saw Jamie experience at the beginning of today's training. Then from a systemic level, there are added barriers as well. There's an assumption that violence is mutual or even consensual, especially if a partner attempts to defend against it. There's also a fear that if a survivor is the more masculine presenting partner, they're going to be perceived to be the abuser. We know that those responding to domestic violence, whether it's the police or social services or your friends or family, have been taught that domestic violence occurs between a man and a woman, with the man being the abuser and the survivor being the woman, often within the context of marriage. So first responders, police officers, DV providers, and friends and family don't know what to do when the domestic violence they're hearing about or seeing doesn't fit into the idea of domestic violence we've been socialized with. And was mentioned in the chat as well, is we know that many domestic violence shelters are women's only spaces. And oftentimes that definition of womanhood doesn't include trans women, and it certainly doesn't include gay and bisexual men or even straight men, right? And we are seeing increasingly Florida and Kansas both pass legislation barring transgender non-binary survivors from accessing domestic violence services and shelter and sexual assault services that align with their gender identity, specifically naming trans and non-binary folks not being able to access domestic violence centers and rape crisis centers. And we're seeing more legislation cropping up like that too. So whether or not legislation is explicitly passed, which again we are seeing, this sends a message loud and clear to survivors who are trans and non-binary across the country: domestic violence shelter space is not for you. So not even on the denial front, we're thinking about how trans survivors aren't even going to make that call because they're already making that assumption that legally or implicitly or socially, they're not going to be accepted in that space. And queer relationships are often not considered to be acceptable family or partnerships, and are often treated less seriously as a result and don't get awarded the same social or legal protections. So an example I think is helpful to contextualize this idea here is around custody. We know custody is more likely to be awarded to a biological parent. So if a survivor is not a biological parent to the child, but is a parent, their abuser, who is a biological parent, may be more likely to be awarded custody over child. And think about how an abusive partner may use that as a threat or weaponize the legal system against a survivor as a tool of abuse. Then even in how we respond to domestic violence, we see some unique issues and barriers. We know that abusive partners are often incorrectly viewed and assessed as survivors and vice versa because of that standard assessment and assumption in the domestic violence world. Is we make assessments on who is an abuser and who's a survivor based off gender, or who came into an agency first, rather than looking at the behavior that's being used by the client and whether it demonstrates an attempt to gain consistent power and control. Those of us who work in domestic violence know this really well, and I think we really need to stress this, is we know that couples therapy is not an effective intervention for domestic violence, and in fact, it puts survivors more at risk of extreme danger, violence, and even murder. And we know that LGBTQ folks, because our abusive relationships aren't treated as seriously as cisgender heterosexual folks, are more likely to be referred to couples therapy to solve issues of abuse, which puts LGBTQ survivors at extreme risk. And lastly, hospitals, doctors, law enforcement, friends, family don't take the same DV precautions or safety assessments as they would with folks who are in cisgender heterosexual relationships. And this can be not issuing a CT scan when a survivor was strangled. This could be not issuing an emergency protective order. This could be not taking a police report, like someone put in the chat, calling something a cat fight rather than calling it domestic violence, and leads to a real lack of safe interventions for LGBTQ folks. We also know that transgender people are disproportionately highly impacted by bias. Like the anti-trans legislation that we're seeing, where trans women are being outlawed from accessing domestic violence shelters, and sexual assault supportive resources. We're seeing the legalization, the codification of anti-trans bias. But we also know that victim service professionals may accidentally or intentionally re-victimize a transgender survivor by committing acts of bias, like we saw in the Jamie exercise again, right? And we know that even from a medical perspective on the research that has been done, we found that 28% of trans people postponed critically needed medical care due to fear of experiencing anti-trans discrimination. So we apply that to victim services, sexual assault organizations, domestic violence organizations. And we know that trans people are not coming in to access services because they're afraid of being met with anti-trans discrimination. And then we think it's really important to name that there is a history and continued prevalence of violence and abuse and mistreatment from the police against trans individuals. And this means that transgender people are not going to seek the police for support and may experience a real threat to their safety when they do. Research has found that 46% of trans respondents surveyed reported that they were uncomfortable seeking the police for help when they needed it. And I'll pass it over to Amy to talk about identity abuse.
Amanda, before we get there, there's a question in the chat that seems relevant. Do federal discrimination laws supersede state laws, as in Florida and Kansas? In other words, what can advocates do to open access as federally funded programs?
I adore you for that question. Thank you so much for that question. We're in the process of working with and meeting with the OVW office, with the FIPSA office around how do states like Kansas and Florida navigate these laws. I can speak a little to Kansas, as Kansas doesn't have an enforcement mechanism for this law saying that people can't access domestic violence shelter services or sexual assault crisis services. And they don't have an enforcement mechanism if a trans person does access shelter. And we've heard from a lot of folks on the ground that they're not going to comply with this. And also it's going against, like you put, federal requirements around non-discrimination. I think we're at the beginning of this legal fight and we don't have clear and specific answers, but I would encourage those in the room who are in Kansas or Florida or other states that inevitably will pass laws like this to take a strong stand. And this is a moment to be vocally and explicitly inclusive of trans survivors in shelter services and crisis services, because we know that trans and non-binary people in those states are going to not seek out services due to fear because of these laws. We know that federal non-discrimination requirements do require domestic violence shelter programs to provide shelter services to folks of all genders in a gender inclusive way, free from discrimination. So that's the federal law, and it's a really complicated, messy situation, but I think we have this opportunity to take a stand here. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, and it seems particularly important as state legislative sessions are starting to come close to an end, and we'll start again to be mindful that these laws are in existence, and that since this law did pass in Kansas, it's likely that copycat laws will come up in other states that have also passed anti-trans legislation this season. I'm from the state of Missouri, so I'm thinking about Missouri passing anti-trans legislation this season. So something for us to all be mindful of and to pay attention to, so that we're able to have kind of a united voice against it. So thanks for answering that question, Amanda. The last kind of larger section of information we're going to share with you all today is about identity abuse. And this is the use of one's identity to demean, manipulate, or control one's partner. The examples we're going to share with you definitely overlap with the other types of abuse you already know, like economic abuse or psychological abuse, for example. But we're going to show some specific ways in which LGBTQ+ people are experiencing these types of abuse. And we're specifically talking about these barriers and giving you examples of identity abuse so that you're able to mitigate these barriers and catch moments of identity abuse when you're working with LGBTQ+ survivors. So we're going to go through some examples. The first one is threatening to out a partner's sexual orientation, gender identity, or HIV status. This could be to keep someone trapped in a relationship or to control a partner's behaviors by threatening to out them to their workplace, their friends, or their family members. We know that this can be economic abuse if we are, making someone not able to work or outing them to a workplace that's not safe for them. We also see this happen a lot with youth and teen dating violence situations. And we know that 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ+, and that is not true of the general population. So we know that threatening to out a partner's sexual orientation is a real threat that happens, especially to our LGBTQ youth. The next one's denying access to medical treatment. This could be taking the form of denying access to gender-affirming care or STI testing, HIV-related care, and more. It could look like an abuser not sharing insurance information with the survivor, financially controlling a survivor, and not allowing the survivor the ability to pay for copays, hiding or tampering with medication, or guilting a survivor into not getting the medical care that they need, and even withholding transportation to medical appointments. The next one is using false stereotypes against the survivor. So for example, accusing a partner of being likely to cheat because they're bisexual and using that false stereotype to question or control where they go and who they spend time with. And the next one is telling a partner they deserve the abuse or never find another partner who treats them better. An abuser could use this sort of language to make a partner feel unlovable because of their HIV status, their gender identity, or their sexual orientation. We have a few more examples here. Intentionally using incorrect pronouns for someone. We talked about this a bit earlier. This could be used as psychological abuse. We also see normalizing violence in LGBTQ+ relationships. So for example, saying comments like all guys fight to normalize and excuse violent or abusive behavior. I know on the chart that Amanda showed earlier, I think the thing that stood out to me the most was that gay men had the lowest reported rate of intimate partner violence. And one can assume, and that one is me, that they're actually experiencing much higher rates of intimate partner violence, but are not reporting it for a variety of reasons. And one being that we normalize violence among men. And also reporting it means that you have to acknowledge that it is existing. And if we can't see ourselves in the services that are offered, yeah, I see in the chat, boys will be boys, exactly. Having this stereotype that men can be physical and fight and it's okay and normal, as opposed to what's actually happening, which is abusive relationships. So thank you for sharing that in the chat. The next one is using the experience of being out for longer to maintain control over a partner. So an abusive partner could say something like, oh, this is just how our relationships are. You wouldn't know because you're newer to this. And then lastly, preventing a survivor from having friendships with people of certain genders or being connected to queer community spaces. And because of those examples of barriers that Amanda gave earlier, we know that often LGBTQ folks aren't connected in the same ways to their family of origin as cisgender heterosexual people are. And so having these queer community spaces are critically important, critically important to avoid isolation. I'm seeing in the chat, is being outed an issue for LGBT older adults as well? Absolutely, Shannon. Yeah, I would say for a variety of reasons. We talk often about the lack of services for LGBTQ seniors. That often in more conservative areas, LGBTQ folks have to almost go back into the closet to get into a senior home and more because of discrimination. And so it's certainly also an issue for older adults as well. Yeah. So when we are responding to identity abuse, we want to remember these two critical things. The first one is naming stereotypes, myths, lies, and abuse tactics for what they are, and really addressing it when you hear it. And then secondly, we want to provide correct information that affirms a survivor and their identity. So we're going to go over just one example of identity abuse. And I would love for folks to add in the chat how they would respond to this client if this client was someone they were working with. And so we are working with a client named Sam. And Sam says, my partner doesn't like it. And we can go to the next slide. My partner doesn't like it when I spend time with friends because I'm bisexual, so I could technically cheat with anyone. Thinking about how we're responding to Sam, again, naming stereotypes, myths, lies, and abuse tactics for what they are, and then providing correct information that affirms a survivor and their identity. How might we respond to Sam? How might we respond to Sam? I see in the chat, trust is crucial in any relationship, absolutely. Just because someone's bisexual doesn't mean they're going to cheat, absolutely. I see cheating is a choice. You're not more likely to cheat because you're bisexual. In a healthy relationship, there's trust. You deserve to spend time with your friends. Does your partner control you in any other ways? Yeah, absolutely. Lots of responses in the chat that are excellent, and we're following these steps, right? We're really naming this for what it is. And abusers will tell their victims they don't trust them because they're bisexual. Absolutely, absolutely. And it doesn't mean someone's going to cheat because they're bisexual. Certainly. I also see in the chat, Sam, this is one of the manipulation tactics that abusers often use to maintain control over someone in a relationship. Certainly. And I'm also seeing, Sam, this is an example of biphobia. Being bi doesn't make you more or less likely to cheat. It sounds like your partner's trying to isolate and control you. I love this. We're like naming it for what it is, and letting Sam know that this is something he doesn't deserve, especially because of his sexual orientation. Yeah, and we might say something like bisexual people aren't any more likely to cheat. It's not fair for anyone to use these inaccurate stereotypes against you to try to control who you see and who you spend time with like that. You deserve to spend time with your friends and the people you care about. Absolutely, there are great responses in the chat. Y'all are doing great. And so that's just one example of responding to identity abuse when we hear it. And so we have some best practices for this section. The first one is never assuming someone's out. We talked about outing for a little bit. We should always assess who a client's out to when we're safety planning with them. We want to respect anxieties about disclosure of identities with a client that might have, and their choices of who they want to share that with. And at the same time, we want to respect a client's choice if they do want to be out. We don't want to discourage a client from coming out. This is certainly their choice. We always want to counteract identity abuse. It's really important that we're looking out for signs of identity abuse when we're working with the survivor. We know this can come in the form of language suggesting self-blame, identity-related shame, or repeating painful things that someone's partner said to them. So whether it's combating victim blaming or identity abuse when you hear it in clients, it's critical that you're addressing explicitly that they didn't deserve this because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their gender expression. So if a client says something like, I just feel like this kind of thing doesn't happen to gay men, you can say, you know, this can and does happen to anyone of any sexual orientation or gender identity, and you're not alone in this, I promise. I know this kind of thing isn't as visible or talked about when it happens to gay men, so know that it's not lost on me how much strength it took for you to come in today. And then lastly, we always want to support survivors with information and referrals to take care of their sexual health and well-being as well. We know that sexual health coercion and reproductive coercion can be particularly painful forms of abuse that come with a lot of shame and stigma. So it's important as providers that we're able to talk about sexual health needs with confidence and information and know appropriate referrals in our community. And so that was our last best practice tip. We do have a little bit of time for questions. So we'll come back to the Q&A here. But we would love to know what you're taking away from this training today. So if folks have time to just throw one best practice or one thing you learned today that you want to incorporate into your service provision, that would be great.
Thank you both so much. And just to echo what Amy said, if there's any other questions, we have about 10-ish minutes left. So if there's any questions you haven't gotten the chance to answer or gotten the chance to ask, please drop them in the Q&A now. in the Q&A. That's the easiest for us to go through. There is a couple of outstanding questions that I'll ask while other people get their questions in. There was a question asking, can you explain more about how to have a balance of supporting inclusivity of LGBTQ survivors while also being mindful of other survivors who are not? I believe that's the wording.
I was trying to type an answer to the question while Amy was.
I know, I figured I'd give your hands a rest.
But I'm not quick enough. But thank you for this question. Supporting inclusivity of LGBTQ survivors doesn't hurt non-LGBTQ survivors, right? Is just like providing inclusive language services to Spanish-speaking survivors doesn't hurt survivors who are English-speaking, right? Providing more inclusive services, providing intentional services for communities that are disproportionately impacted or experience disproportionate barriers, at worst creates some questions from non-LGBTQ folks, right? So if you have a non-LGBTQ survivor you're working with who asks a question like, why do you have pride flags up? Or why are you asking me about my pronouns or something like that? I'm guessing that's what this question is referring to. I always say respond with a simple, short answer, like something like, we provide services to survivors of all gender identities and sexual orientations, and this is a part of our efforts to be LGBTQ inclusive. If we're asking questions around intake, we can always say, please know these questions are optional and aren't required for you to receive services. The person is worried it's going to be a barrier to receive services. You just want to clarify that. But just, explaining that you're trying to be an LGBTQ inclusive provider, I think answers that question for the vast majority of folks. We do provide more in-depth training that I wish we had time to go over today around how to mitigate anti-LGBTQ bias amongst clients. So particularly in shelter settings, what to do if a shelter resident is treating another shelter resident with anti-LGBTQ bias. So I encourage folks to connect with us about future trainings, but we don't have time to go over all of that today.
Thank you so much for that.
To add?
I would just add that I think if we're trying to make something more inclusive for everyone, then it makes it more inclusive for everyone. And so if we're making something more inclusive for LGBTQ plus folks, it means that it's going to be more inclusive for everyone. That's all I want to add.
There was another question asking just to kind of clarify the terminology between the difference between male and man.
Also, just one more thought to add on the previous question.
Oh yeah, no, sorry.
But yes, I'll circle back and answer that. Is also, I've worked as a domestic violence and sexual assault advocate for about a decade. And I had many clients I worked with who were cisgender women in a relationship with a man, and didn't share with me that they were bisexual, pansexual, queer until we had LGBTQ inclusion efforts at the organization, and then they felt safe to share that with me. And because they shared that with me, we were able to identify, sources of support groups, resources that person needed, have a more affirming experience. They were able to tell me about abusive relationships with same gender partners that we were able to then talk about. It opened up the door to providing, more specific and culturally responsive services. So I would say this, like Amy said, providing more inclusive services actually does open the door to more inclusive services for everyone. And to answer the question of male and man and the terminology, if we go back to the concepts that Amy walked us through at the beginning of this presentation, we have sex assigned at birth. And that's where you'll hear terminology like female, male, and intersex as examples of sex assigned at birth. And typically this is what we think about when a doctor looks between a baby's legs and says this is a baby boy or this is a baby girl, right? When we're talking about man, we're talking about someone's gender identity, their internal sense of how they understand themselves to be and their gender. So this encompasses cisgender men, and this encompasses cisgender men and transgender men, right? So cisgender men being men whose sex assigned at birth is male, and their gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. Transgender men being folks whose sex assigned at birth was female or intersex or other, and their gender identity is a man.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I think we only have one more unanswered question in the Q&A as of now, and that is how to ask about someone's sexual orientation in a professional way, how to go about addressing that in, a way that's not harmful.
Yeah. So first part of this question would be go back to, is that question relevant to providing inclusive services to that person? And sometimes it is, right? A lot of us in the domestic violence case management field support survivors with applying for jobs or employment safety planning. And so an example I always give about where this could be really important is, say we're talking about a survivor sharing a restraining order with their employer, so that employer knows not to accept that person on their premises, or they're applying for domestic violence workplace accommodations or something else. That restraining order might have that person's name on there, and that person's name might ID the employer on the gender of their partner, and that would out the person in the workplace. So that's an example of where it could be really important to support that survivor around, do they want to be out in the workplace? Are they out in the workplace? What would be different scenarios of what might happen if they were out in the workplace, and how can we work around that to identify safety for that person? So to go with that example for a moment, maybe we write a letter as a domestic violence advocate saying, I am verifying that this person is experiencing domestic violence and requesting workplace accommodations. No name on there of the abuser, no gender of the abuser, but then that survivor now has documentation they need to ask for the workplace accommodations. So how to ask that question, same principles you would with general advocacy, motivational interviewing. Say, like, do you have any concerns around employment? I know you shared with me that you're LGBTQ and some folks have experienced, discrimination from their workplace. And I want to see if being out in the workplace is something that impacts your safety plan.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much, Amanda. Since we do have a couple of minutes left, I'll give anyone who might want to another second or two to drop some questions in the Q&A. In the meantime, just another reminder that the recording of this training, the PowerPoint, and some additional resources will be sent out in the next couple of days to all registrants for the training. And a couple links were dropped in the chat before for registration for our National Training Institute and for next month's webinar as well, which we're super excited about. I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes back of their day and thank Amy and Amanda again for such an incredible presentation. We really appreciated you guys joining us today. Y'all joining us today. It's clear I use guys so much and I'm still working on it. So thank you both again. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.